Welcome to Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. I'm Timothy.
And I'm Caleb.
And you're listening to Bible Discussions, the forum where we explore biblical topics that are relevant to your life. Today, we are continuing our series entitled, Who is Jesus Christ and Why Do I Need Him? In this episode, we're going to look at the book of 2 Samuel. And in the Old Testament, we're going to focus in on the concept of humility. Then we're going to turn to the New Testament and we're going to explore the humility of Jesus Christ. So 2 Samuel is really the second half of the book of Samuel. So I know in our Old Testaments, in the English Old Testaments, it's shown as Christian New Testament, it's shown as 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. But in the Hebrew Bible, it's just one book of Samuel. And like we talked about last week, it's also part of the former prophets in the Hebrew Bible. So the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings together viewed as the former prophets. So, Caleb, you're the historian. Tell us what's going on when we get into the book of 2 Samuel in our English Bibles.
Well, at the end of 1 Samuel, Samuel dies, and that's kind of the cutoff between the two, which is one book, really, but the reason it was separated, that's kind of what happens right in the middle. And the narrative shifts to focus on David. We've already seen a lot of David in 1 Samuel, but he's been mostly on the run from King Saul. So, as you mentioned, a lot of 2 Samuel is a humbling time for David, even though 1 Samuel often was too. As the book of 1 Samuel finishes, Saul and Jonathan are also going to be killed by the Philistines. So, Samuel wasn't killed by the Philistines, but Saul and Jonathan will be dead as well. So, 2 Samuel really is the time of David's reign, when David is king over Israel, and that's kind of at the beginning. Saul's dead, and by the end of it, it'll end with David's death. So
yeah, so it opens, because Saul and Jonathan die, and of course Jonathan was David's best friend. So it has this beautiful passage that's a lament that David wrote, and in it he has this famous verse that is probably the most well-recognized verse from the whole book, where he's lauding Jonathan, and he says in 2 Samuel 1:25 and 26, he says, "How the mighty have fallen in battle! Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of a woman." So that gets a lot of attention.
yeah, well, how the mighty have fallen is a really famous phrase.
That's true too. Yeah, and it gets all this attention because it talks about a love of a man for another man, but it's not a sexual type of love, right? Because that's the whole point of the poem that David's writing is to write it that way, to compare it to the love of a woman,
Right.
is to draw the distinction. It's like, we're not talking about sexual love, as wonderful as that is.
Well, and if you go back and look, if you read the whole of 1 Samuel, which we've had to gloss over some things, you can see the relationship between David and Jonathan. Jonathan remains David's best friend even while his dad is trying to kill David. And even though David is the heir to the throne, which under normal circumstances you would expect to be Jonathan, and he actually helps David escape on a couple of occasions, and shows a lot of kindness to him. So it's a very different context. I mean, David owes him his life, literally, and he's also just thankful for his friendship.
Well, and Jonathan suffers the abuse of his father also over his kindness and friendship with David. So, and in this first chapter, it just kind of sets the tone, I think, for the rest of the book, because, you lose your best friend, things aren't going well for you. And then one after another, there's this cascade of things that start to happen to David throughout the book, right?
Right. Well, like we said, it's a very humbling time for David. It's kind of up and down, really.
There are good things in there too, but like we have to do in order to present this material to you, we've been picking the attribute we want to focus on, and so we kind of pull those parts out, but give them plenty of context. But yeah, it has good things like David's victories and his establishing his kingdom and so on. But then he doesn't
really get to live happily ever after. Like there's
Mhm.
always another problem for him.
That's true.
So, so just to give a whole list of things that'll happen to him.
Mhm.
Um, Joab will so he lost Samuel, Saul, and Jonathan first of all in close succession at the end of First Samuel, and then Joab, which is David's general, murders Abner, who was Saul's general, against David's orders. David had sworn to Jonathan, mostly on behalf of Jonathan, but also, as we saw in the last episode, because he respected Saul as the Lord's anointed, he had sworn to take care of Saul's household. Um, so so he's angry that Joab is exacting revenge here. Um, God tells David that he's not going to be the one to build the temple. David wanted to bring the ark into Jerusalem and build a temple for God, but God tells him it won't be him to do it.
Yeah, that was
Probably
in
because he
chapter
knows,
7.
yeah, he knows that his life's going to be a roller coaster. In chapter 11 and 12, we have one of the most famous stories in the Bible: David and Bathsheba have
Mhm.
an affair and kill off Bathsheba's husband because he's, being annoying, trying to be honorable and all that, unlike them. And then the prophet Nathan calls David out on it in chapter 12, um, and there's a lot of, for the whole kingdom, there's punishment because of that.
That has a great little parable in there when Nathan comes to David and tells him a story about a guy who raised a little lamb that was like part of his family, and
Right.
and then his next door neighbor is super rich,
He
and
said he fed it from his hand. It's
yeah,
at his side. It's the only sheep he had.
yeah, and then his next door neighbor has like tons of livestock, but he has guests coming, so he just takes that lamb, kills it, and eats it, serves it to his friends.
Yeah, and David,
And
he tells him this as if it's Nathan tells it like a true story, and David, you can picture him like leaping to his feet and grabbing his sword. Where is the guy? He's gonna suffer for it.
yeah, and he
Uh,
starts quoting the law,
yeah,
exactly what has to happen.
and Nathan
And
says, "You're the man," and then David realizes what he's talking about because he has the king. He has multiple wives and concubines, which is problematic in itself. But he went and took his faithful servant Uriah, took his wife, and he tried to get he tried to cover it up. He brought Uriah home from the war, and he was like, "Hey, good job, bud. Just go home to your wife, relax a little bit." and,
yeah,
and
yeah,
Uriah's like, "No, my brothers are out sleeping in tents. I'm not gonna go enjoy the comforts of home. I'm gonna sleep on the steps
yeah.
of your palace." And David's like, "Ah."
He couldn't hide his sin, that's for sure.
Yeah. So it was just, I mean, you can't imagine the guilt. Like he's trying to undo it, and this guy's just so perfect, and that's
Yeah.
the guy that he cheated on, and then he has him killed.
This is kind of the nature of the humility lessons that David gets. You know, he makes big mistakes. He tries to hide them, and and then they unravel on him, or
Yeah.
or they sort of come back on him. Maybe he's not been doing a good job, say, of being a father, and he's ignoring the
Well, yeah.
responsibility of as a dad, and then it all falls apart on him. Like this next story we're
Well,
going
like
to
I
talk.
said, you have dozens of wives and concubines.
Yeah.
I think that's problematic in and of itself. But
Yes.
also, he's still willing to break apart and destroy another family. So you can't imagine that the home life is great. I don't think the kids are having a lot of um, time with dad, probably.
No, which comes out in,
And
in chapter
yeah,
13.
and we see a lot of the fighting. We'll also see um, instances of the mothers trying to vie to get their son in power. So in chapter 13, one of the more disturbing stories in the whole Bible, Amnon, one of David's sons, uh, really has a thing for his half sister Tamar,
Hmm.
and
I wouldn't even call it love
well,
because
yeah, he
of what he
forces
does.
himself on her.
Mhm.
He tricks her, and he pretends to be sick, and then has her brought to comfort him,
Mhm.
and he takes advantage of her. And then Absalom kills Amnon for that, which, I mean, fair enough, I guess. But then Absalom takes it upon himself to overthrow David and try to rule the country. So there's just
Yeah.
turmoil in David's household and family,
Yeah.
and he's on the run again, just like he was under Saul. Only now it's his own son.
Yeah. It's he has to leave Jerusalem because Absalom is threatening to take over the kingdom by force, and he doesn't want to fight with his own son. So he so he leaves, and then in one of I think was my favorite story, probably one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament, is the story of Shimei. And we're going to break that one down in detail in a minute. But that's in chapter 16, where David's leaving town and one of Saul's relatives comes and basically abuses David the whole way out of town, and David has to sit and take it.
Yeah.
And that's chapter 16's got some other disturbing stuff in it besides David having to flee. When Absalom does come into town, he then sleeps with all of his father's concubines in a tent that he sets up on top of the palace. So that's
publicly. He wants everyone to know that he's doing that. Which, keep in mind, these are like his stepmothers. So
yeah,
it's really messed up.
So David is that's weird. David has fled town, and then there's a battle ensuing between his forces and Absalom's forces.
Right, and he's given orders to protect the life of Absalom. I mean, he's going to he's trying to take the kingdom back, but he doesn't want Absalom killed. But certain members of the military don't listen to him, involving Joab again.
Yeah.
Joab shouldn't be his right hand man, I don't think.
No.
But so Absalom's killed, and then David mourns Absalom. And it's very similar to the situation with Saul and Abner before, where these had been his enemies trying to kill him, but he tried to show mercy to them, and then when they die, he mourns them. And that's another thing to point out, is that during this time, during David's whole life, he's probably writing many of the Psalms, especially at these low points, when he's on the run and people are kicking dirt in his eyes, figuratively and literally, in the case of Shimei.
Yeah, that's a good point.
The Psalms are being written at this time. That would be a good thing if you're trying to read along in the Bible through this series. It would be a good time to maybe look at a few Psalms, just because that's going to be a long one to get through when we do get to it.
Yeah. And it's one thing, I think, when a prophet comes and rebukes you, because you feel like, oh, he's got the word of God, like when Nathan came and convicted him of what he did with Bathsheba. But then here, like in chapter 18, when Absalom dies and he mourns for him, and then in chapter 19, Joab is, you said, is not very helpful.
Joab tells him off.
Right hand man. Yeah, he comes and rebukes him. He's like, hey, like the men just gave up their lives, risked their lives for you, and they won this great battle, and then you're like crying about it,
Yeah.
And it's similar. Like if you think about it in the history of the United States, it's like the Vietnam War, where we sent people overseas to fight, and then when they came home, people spit on them at the airports and stuff. David was doing that number.
They saw a lot of traumatic things and were just kind of thrown under the rug for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And a lot of them were drafted, didn't want to go in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the closest analog I could think of for.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about that. That's a good comparison
for our modern minds.
Right. Well, they disobeyed David's orders and they killed his son,
Well, some of them. Yeah. But yeah. So I think then there's this other interesting story right at the end of the book where David counts the fighting men. And he's not supposed to, and then there's
he takes
plague.
Like a full. He's basically trying to gauge his own strength.
Yeah,
is what he's doing.
Trusting in his own arm instead of the Lord's, and
then it's very similar to the incident with Bathsheba, because there's a punishment on the whole nation because of David's actions, which we remember back in 1 Samuel when the people demand a king. They ask Samuel to put a king over them. He tells them, well, you're not going to like that. I mean, he's going to make decisions for you. He's going to take your daughters as wives. He's going to take your sons and get them killed in war. He's going to have kind of this authority over you. And we can see that here, both with the actions of the other, of Saul and Absalom, the people trying to overthrow David, as well as David himself. When he messes up, there are consequences for everyone.
Yeah, and 70,000 people die in the plague.
Yeah, after he counts the fighting men.
Yeah, and we're actually going to talk about this in more depth in a future episode. That's going to be what we zero in on in Second Chronicles, I think, or First Chronicles. So,
yeah, the Book of Chronicles kind of recaps things that have been happening.
So we're going to take a closer look at the story of David and the census there.
So we're zooming through all this history right now, but we got to pick one thing to focus on. So
Yep. So you can see, hopefully you can get a flavor for just how many, negative things are happening to David throughout 2 Samuel, and how David's having to deal with all this loss of his best friend, and the difficulties with his children, difficulties with his love life. Well, he pretty much brings on himself. But they're all humiliating, basically. That's what we wanted to focus in on. David learned humility the hard way by bringing it upon himself or having it thrust upon him. However many different ways you can think of, David was humbled. So that's kind of the overall feeling of the book. And I wanted to focus in on one of these stories because, like I said earlier, it's like one of my favorite stories in the whole Old Testament. But it's the story of Shimei, the son of Gera, and it's in 2 Samuel 16. So I'll go ahead and read verses 5 through 14 to give you the beginning of this encounter that David has. And remember, David, he's leaving Jerusalem in disgrace. He's afraid, well, not afraid, but he's unwilling to fight his own son. And so he's just going to leave town before it comes to bloodshed. He's afraid that Absalom doesn't share his feelings. He wants to come and kill everybody. And so he's going to get out and save his own skin and that of his family. So he leaves. And here's what it says happens. As King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there. His name was Shimei, son of Gera. And he cursed as he came out. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops and the special guard were on David's right and left. As he cursed, Shimei said, get out, you murderer, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hands of your son Absalom. You have come to ruin because you are a murderer. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head. But the king said, what does this have to do with you, you son of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, curse David, who can ask, why do you do this? David then said to Abishai and all his officials, my son, my own flesh and blood is trying to kill me. How much more then this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore to me his covenant blessing instead of his curse today. So David and his men continued along the road with Shimei, while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing as he went and throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt. The king and all the people with him arrived at their destination exhausted, and there he refreshed himself.
I think Shimei should be exhausted too.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, throwing rocks and dirt the whole way.
Well, I mean, I almost like picture that there's like two parallel roads on a hillside, one above the other, and Shimei's just up there kicking dirt down on everybody the whole way. It's no wonder that they wanted to go over and cut his head off.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of like Abishai's approach there, just really, really direct.
Yeah. So, this is, and David's view of it is, well, I probably deserve it,
He has brought the issue on himself.
Mm-hmm. And he's like, just let the guy go. If God's mad at me, how much more, let this guy be mad at me too. So, but he's leaving Jerusalem for two reasons, right? One reason we talked about a minute ago was that he didn't want to fight his own son, Absalom. And the other reason that you hear David talking about in this verse is that he wants God to decide if he should remain king. And it also is something that he had already said in 2 Samuel 15 before he left town, verses 25 and 26. And we'll go back and read those. They say, then the king said to Zadok, take the ark of God back into the city. Well, this is while they were on their way out of town and they'd gotten a certain distance with the ark. He says, take it back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again. But if he says, I am not pleased with you, then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him. So this is the mindset David had while he was going out of the town. And this is the mindset he had when Shimei is cursing him. It's just like, you know what? It's in God's hands right now. I'm going to wait and see what God does with this situation. I don't want to kill my son. I don't want to stay king if God doesn't want me to be king. But if he wants me to be king, I'll be turning around and I'll be coming back.
Mm. Yeah, and there are a lot of echoes there from what we saw in the last episode with the anointing, right?
Mhm.
And also this is something we jumped over here with the death of Saul. The way that Saul dies, there's a battle that they're losing and they're in retreat, and he tells one of his soldiers he doesn't want to be captured by the enemy because he's afraid of facing torture and humiliation. So he gets one of his soldiers to kill him himself, just a quicker and less painful death. And then that guy comes to report to David because he's thinking, I know this guy's been on the run for forever. He's supposed to be the next king. He'll be glad to hear that I helped him out. And David is not. He has the man put to death for
Mhm.
touching killing the Lord's anointed.
Yeah.
So we see consistently here this same respect that David has for the anointing. He knows that he's anointed and Absalom isn't. So he's trusting God to renew the covenant with him, as he says.
Yeah. Yes, he does. Yeah, it's an amazing kind of look inside David's mind, there. And so here he is, he's fleeing town. He has this mindset and he gets to Bahraim, and then he's met by Shimei. And Shimei has this accusation that he makes against David in verse 8, where he says that you've shed the blood of Saul's family and all of this. And of course, there was blood shed in Saul's family because they were in a war, but
Right.
it was not because David wanted to shed the blood. He was trying to honor Saul and also his friend Jonathan and take care of their family. But things happen in war, so David isn't really guilty of causing injury to Saul's family. He has allowed this to play out, like we said, in accordance with God's anointing and purposes. And so it's sort of a false accusation that Shimei is bringing. Uh, if we ran down the history of David's actions towards Saul's family, right? He spared his life 2 times. We looked at those last week, about his respect for God's anointing. So
hmm
he'd already done that, and then he loved Jonathan like a better than a brother. And we see that in the lament that we read earlier, and how much David loved Jonathan and his friendship. And then when Saul did die, he mourned Saul's death, which was also a part of that lament that we didn't read.
hmm
And then he avenged Ishbosheth, who is one of Saul's sons who was murdered. And the same
He
thing.
he briefly ruled Israel after Saul's death. Like Abner, Saul's general, was allied to Ishbosheth, so he kind of had him installed as a king. And then when Abner, that's another point too. David gets mad at Joab for killing Abner. Abner had come and met with Joab, and it kind of seemed like he was going to hand the kingdom over to David, and then Joab has him killed, and then Ishbosheth is killed as well.
Mhm.
Um,
And David kills the people who.
it's the same story
did that.
almost as when Saul was killed. The guys who killed Ishbosheth come and tell David, and he's like, "Oh, you think you did me a favor? Well, I don't like your methods,
Yeah.
so we'll see how you like them."
Yeah, and so then also Jonathan had a remaining son who Mephibosheth, and so David lets him stay in the palace and eat at his table.
Because he had sworn both to Saul and Jonathan that he wouldn't let their line die out.
Yeah,
And so he finds Mephibosheth, who I'm sure was very nervous when he heard the news. Oh, the king is sent for you.
Yeah.
I'm the last of Saul's family. I wonder what's going to happen. But and he was a cripple, and David had him, live in his household and
yeah.
sit in a place of honor.
So
That's in 2 Samuel 9. We skipped over that because it was one of the high points.
well, and so David is in some ways being unjustly accused as he leaves in disgrace, but David doesn't use that as an opportunity to shed Shimei's blood.
Mhm.
And so,
Well, like we talked about, he is kind of guilty here because it's his messed up family that's causing all the problems here. Amnon taking advantage of Tamar, and then Absalom kills Amnon for that, and then probably correctly realizes, if David was a better dad, this wouldn't have happened. Amnon's just following his example. He took the wife of one of his most trusted soldiers and then had that guy killed. So,
Mm. Yeah.
David has kind of set a bad example for his sons and allowed them to grow into the shining moral examples that they've become.
Well, and Absalom isn't doing the right thing either, and he ends up dying, as we talked about earlier, and David mourns for him. But then David turns around and he comes back into Jerusalem.
Mm.
And it's really kind of a cool story because as David's coming back across the river to come back into Jerusalem, back across the Jordan, guess who is the very first person to run out to meet him and help him across the river?
It's Shimei.
Yeah, his old buddy Shimei. Best friends, remember?
It does point out here that he's a Benjamite, which is the same tribe as Saul.
Yeah.
So that probably some of the bitterness he had earlier.
Sure, yeah.
Was because of the relation there.
So this is in 2 Samuel 19, 16 through 23. Do you want to read that for us?
Sure. Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, hurried down with the men of Judah to meet King David. With him were 1,000 Benjamites, along with Ziba, the steward of Saul's household, and his 15 sons and 20 servants. When they rushed to the Jordan, where the king was. They crossed at the ford to take the king's household over and to do whatever he wished. When Shimei, son of Gera, crossed the Jordan, he fell prostrate before the king and said to him, "May my lord not hold me guilty. Do not remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. May the king put it out of his mind. For I, your servant, know that I have sinned. But today I have come here as the first from the tribes of Joseph to come down and meet my lord the king." Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said, "Shouldn't Shimei be put to death for this? He cursed the Lord's anointed." David replied, "What does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? What right do you have to interfere? Should anyone be put to death in Israel today? Don't I know that I am king over Israel?" So the king said to Shimei, "You shall not die." And the king promised him on oath.
So this is just such a crazy story after all the things that Shimei did earlier when David was leaving town. And then he's like the first one to come back and say,
He was
welcome back.
the last one following him out of town to mock him. Stuck with him. It sounds like a lot longer than anyone else did, other than the people who were still following David.
And then Abishai has the same solution that he had last time.
Yeah.
Let me go cut this guy's head off.
He's not one for variety.
So why would David put up with Shimei when he does these ridiculous things like this?
Well, I like his response. Should anyone be put to death in Israel today? It's kind of he's saying that it's a day of celebration.
Yes.
Things are right. I'm not going to start it off by beheading people, and anyone who opposed me.
Am I not the king of Israel, he says.
Right. He knows, because Abishai is appealing to his anointing there. Didn't he curse the Lord's anointed?
Mm-hmm.
And he says, well, I know I'm not dependent on Shimei's judgment to know whether or not I'm God's anointed, and I'm coming back into my kingdom now. So, but he, you like to say that Shimei is David's barometer for the people's opinion of him.
That's it. That's what I like to say. Yeah, because when David was at his lowest, just like a barometer, right? You got high and low pressure. When he's at his lowest, there's Shimei cursing him, and there's nothing he can do about it because he's like, "Yeah, I deserve it." Even if Shimei of all people can curse me, then I am really down right now.
Well, he points out, my son Absalom, my own flesh and blood, is trying to kill me. So why wouldn't this guy?
Yeah, and then it's like, but when he's coming back, it's another barometer because David's at the top, and Shimei is like, "Oh, David's at the top. I better." Act as such. And so he's like, "Welcome back, David. No, it's all forgotten." And so
let me bring it up 5 times so you don't remember it.
Yeah. I mean, since what we're focusing on is humility, David actually, displays humility in both situations. He displays humility when he's at the bottom. He's like, "I'm not killing him. I deserve it." And he displays it at the top because he's like, "I'm not killing him because I deserve it now."
That's kind of interesting. That reminds me of, I know this is New Testament, but when Paul talks about the secret to finding contentment with plenty or with little, whether you're prosperous or struggling, it makes me think of that.
Yeah,
David has the same humility either way. He doesn't use his his humiliation, when he's fallen low, he doesn't use that as an excuse to take it out on Shimei or anyone, and he also doesn't get full of himself when he's put back on top.
Yeah, and he also said, well, I mean, when I see Shimei acting like this, I know that God has exalted me, because ultimately we can't exalt ourselves. Only God can exalt.
Mm.
And of course, God can humble as well. And so in both cases, I think David was like, well, Shimei is showing me, what God's will is for me.
Yeah.
So, well, that's the good part of the Shimei story. The Shimei story is not over yet. So how did things turn out for Shimei? Well, if you read 2 Samuel by itself, it looks like they turn out pretty good. David makes him this promise, I'll never hurt you and everything. But then, and we also have David's last words come in 2 Samuel 23, 1-7. It's presented as David's last words, and this nice little poem. It's the official version, from the kingdom. Like, here's David's official last words.
Yeah, I called it earlier. It's the White House press secretary's release to the press.
Yeah. It's like,
this is what the president says.
Here's his last words. And so when the book closes, you're like, well, I guess thing turns out Shimei got to survive. But David's real last words are recorded in 1 Kings 2.
In private with Solomon.
Yeah, 8 and 9. And he says to Solomon, well, he's actually said some other things that he wants to see happen to some people. But then he says in verses 8 and 9.
Joab.
Yeah,
who we saw earlier.
He says, and remember, you have with you Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite, the Benjamite from Bahurim, who called down bitter curses on me the day I went to Mahanaim. When he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, I will not put you to death by the sword. But now do not consider him innocent. You are a man of wisdom. You will know what to do to him. Bring his gray head down to the grave in blood.
Ugh.
Yeah, so it's really a nasty verse. And this is like David's last words, and you think, man, you learn so many good lessons about humility.
Yeah, this is like not what you want to be telling your son on your deathbed,
Yeah,
it should
because
be like advice or just reminiscing on good times, or could you kill my enemies violently?
yeah, the next verse actually says that David went to rest with his fathers, and so that's the end.
This is the last recorded thing he ever did.
Yeah. And you think how small it is of David now to just say, I want to seek vengeance on. And it's so insidious. It's almost like the sin with Bathsheba, because David tells Solomon, okay, you're a really wise person. I don't want you to get any blood guilt on you over this. So come up with an ingenious way, to get rid of this guy.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the mafia style, like make it look like it was an accident,
Well, what happens is Solomon tells Shimei that he can't leave the city, I think, right?
Yes.
He says that he's safe as long as he stays within the city, and then
well, we can read it.
Okay.
We've got the whole plan in the Bible here. We can read Solomon's plan. So here's what you want to go ahead and read it?
So in 1 Kings 2:36-46, the king, which is now Solomon, the king sent for Shimei and said to him, build yourself a house in Jerusalem and live there, but do not go anywhere else. The day you leave and cross the Kidron Valley, you can be sure you will die. Your blood will be on your own head. So there's, what David said, find a way to do it where you're not really responsible.
Yeah.
And Shimei answered the king, what you say is good. Your servant will do as my lord the king has said. And what else is he supposed to? No. And Shimei stayed in Jerusalem for a long time. But 3 years later, 2 of Shimei's slaves ran off to Achish, son of Maacah, king of Gath, and Shimei was told, your slaves are in Gath. At this, he saddled his donkey and went to Achish in Gath in search of his slaves. So Shimei went away and brought the slaves back from Gath. When Solomon was told that Shimei had gone from Jerusalem to Gath and had returned, the king summoned Shimei and said to him, did I not make you swear by the Lord and warn you, on the day you leave to go anywhere else, you can be sure you will die? At that time you said to me, what you say is good, I will obey. Why then did you not keep your oath to the Lord and obey the command I gave you? The king also said to Shimei, You know in your heart all the wrong you did to my father David. Now the Lord will repay you for your wrongdoing, but King Solomon will be blessed, and David's throne will remain secure before the Lord forever. Then the king gave the order to Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, and he went out and struck Shimei down, and he died. The kingdom was now established in Solomon's hands. So remember when David is coming back into Jerusalem, and Abishai asks, "Why not kill Shimei?" He says, "Well, is this a day for killing people? You know, I'm restored to my kingdom. We're not going to start things off on that foot." Apparently, he has no problem starting off Solomon's kingship like that, though. So
Yeah.
I would think that the wise thing to do would be, he should have thought about this. It's just like the bad examples that he's setting for his other sons. He's telling Solomon, and Shimei was not the only one. Like we said, Joab, he's having him take revenge on other people, and that's how he starts off Solomon's kingship.
Yeah, well, it's a very disappointing way for David's life to end and his kingdom to end when he had accomplished so many good things, and then he caps it with such a terrible action as this.
Well, it's reminiscent of Judges, because other than maybe Deborah or some of the other ones who don't get mentioned that much, they don't seem to have as big of a role as Deborah. All the other ones, Gideon and Samson, things always go wrong at the end. The people are turning to idol worship with Gideon, and Samson doesn't really seem to actually do anything right other than just kill all the Lord's enemies.
And then you have the crazy ending of the book.
Right, and it says
with the concubine that's cut up in 12 pieces and spread around the country.
And then we had Jephthah, who sacrifices his own daughter. And, the point is, all of these human heroes just fall short,
Yeah.
Maybe they can pull things out for a moment, but they can't keep it there. And unfortunately, David's the same way. The end of Judges said that there was no king in the land, and all the people, were kind of left to their own devices. But even with a king, it doesn't seem to be much better.
No, I think that's the entire Old Testament is like an object lesson of ways not to do things.
And David and Solomon are about as good as it gets for their kings. Like most of the other kings are worse.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's just, you get to this and you feel kind of a letdown. Why is it ending this way? But I think you're supposed to feel that way, just like Judges was supposed to make you realize that trusting in a human hero is a bad idea, and trusting in a human king is a bad idea too. There is a king that we can trust, and that's the one that David had been putting his faith in and his hope in when he was on the run. And the lesson we're supposed to learn from this is that no man does that perfectly. But we all need to submit directly to God.
That's right.
So our Old Testament takeaway is that all men are subject to weakness and humility, even the king.
Maybe especially the king.
Especially the king, yeah, because you can't be a good leader, right? If you don't practice humility,
right? Well, and all the power tends to corrupt you.
That's right. Yeah, because we all fail, and the biggest fail of all that none of us can escape is death, and so we're all going to die. The flesh is weak, and it's going to let us down, and we will die. And so ultimately, there's nothing that man can exalt, right? That he can keep it exalted there, because he's going to fall himself, and any efforts he had to prop something up are going to die with him when he dies. But the only one who can truly exalt is God.
Right. Well, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, right?
Yeah.
And that's what we see with David's life. Anytime he starts to get full of himself, when he takes the census of the fighting men to see his full strength, because he's trusting in his own power, God punishes him for that. He takes Bathsheba to himself and tries to cover it up. Every time he gets full of himself, things fall apart. And whenever he humbles himself, even if this nobody Shimei is cursing him, then God brings him back out of that and exalts him again.
Which is the second half of the verse. And whoever humbles himself is exalted. So that leads us to our New Testament study, right? And we just want to focus on one passage in the New Testament that is the height, I guess, if you can have the height of humility. Yeah.
Yeah.
But is the focus of humility in our study anyway, and probably one of the greatest passages in the New Testament, which is Philippians 2 verses 1 through 11, which focuses on the humility of Jesus Christ. So I'll read that. It says, "Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father."
That's another one of those passages in the New Testament that kind of sums like almost all of Christianity up.
Yeah. Like Romans 8, like
Yeah.
we talked about last week. Yeah, this is a great one. So what are your thoughts on while you were listening to that?
I like at the beginning when it talks about unity, and not doing anything out of selfish ambition, right?
Mhm.
That's what we see with David. Every time he starts to think about himself is when things fall apart, And if he and it says, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. If David had thought about the interests of his sons and wives, unfortunately he had so many, which is part of the problem most likely. But had he been thinking about the interests of his family, and maybe his sons would have turned out better.
Mhm.
Even Solomon, he decides to start him off on the wrong foot by having him kill a bunch of people for him. So the consequences that has flow out. It's not just for him; it flows out into the rest of the kingdom, especially because he's king. But even if you're just kind of an average Joe, your actions and your priorities still affect a lot of people around you.
Yeah, a few months ago, I was talking to my old Greek professor, Dr. James Shelton, about this verse that you were talking about here in the early part of it, and how to read it into English, because it's difficult to translate it exactly what it means. But maybe we'll have a separate Bible scholar session. We'll get Dr. Shelton on to break down this exact exchange in here in the first four verses. But this idea of not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interest of others. And it's kind of like don't be narcissistic. Don't look just to your own interests.
Mm.
Like if you make your focus my interests only, that's kind of like what it's talking about. But be more, look at the interests of everybody involved, not just what can I get for myself. So, which,
Yeah. Sorry.
no, go ahead.
I was going to say, we talked in a previous episode. I can't remember which one now. You brought up, we say L1 and L2, love God and love others. I remember it's corny, but I think it's true. I remember at church we used to have this poster that was said, you love Jesus, others, and then yourself. And the acronym was JOY. And that's what leads to a joyful life, is not putting yourself first.
Yeah, that's nice.
And it was pretty cheesy, but
Well,
it's in there.
Well, sometimes those are the most motivating things. The cheesy things are easy to remember.
Right.
When you have to have a a motto or a mission statement or something. If something that's memorable, people can incorporate. So, just a beautiful passage here about Christ and how, when he found himself in the likeness of man, he submitted to death. And I think, right, that's kind of like the whole thing about Christ choosing to become a man and come and walk as God incarnate, that when you choose to become a man, you're choosing to die. And Jesus didn't choose to become a man and then, but I'm not going to be subject to death like all other men are. He chose to come as a man and submit to death. And not only would he die, but the most humiliating of deaths on a cross. So in the crucifixion.
Yeah, and when it comes to all men dying, that's that thing we've seen that all the judges and all the kings have in common. They've all got other flaws, but particularly death. Even if they're a good or halfway decent ruler, they just can't keep it up forever. And so Jesus comes in, and he doesn't just conquer death by elevating himself over it. He submits to it. And like we saw, we quoted that other verse, those who submit themselves will be exalted. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled. And here the at the very end of the passage, the second Philippians passage, that therefore God exalted him. So because of his humility, God exalted him to the highest place. And there's a lot of phrases there that you hear a lot, especially in hymns and worship, that every knee will bow, and every tongue confess Christ is Lord. It's Jesus's glory is because he humbled himself so much.
Yeah, it's kind of like in the Old Testament story we looked at when David chose to humble himself and say, well, whatever God decides, I'll go with that. And then he ends up coming back to Jerusalem. There's a lot of parallels between what happened to David and what's going on with Jesus. So I thought it'd be interesting to kind of look at those parallels, compare how did David respond to the Shimei incident, for instance, and how did Jesus respond to what happened to him, because they were both being expelled from Jerusalem as a rejected king.
That's true.
And so when David is expelled and he runs into Shimei and all the things we talked about happen to him, well, when Jesus is rejected as king and subjected to the crucifixion, there's a lot of heaping of abuse that occurs to Jesus, but it begins with a false accusation, just like David was accused by Shimei of being wronging Saul's family. Jesus is accused in Matthew 29 Matthew 26 verses 59 through 66. He says, the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death, but they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. You have said so, Jesus replied. But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, he has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? He is worthy of death, they answered. So
that's Jesus's words there are a callback to Old Testament prophecy, coming on the clouds of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And he always calls himself the Son of Man, but
from Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, it seems pretty limited who could possibly be coming on the clouds of heaven. It's not going to be an ordinary man.
No.
So that's a claim to something higher.
Well, and like it's just like with Shimei bringing false accusations, they had brought many, many people with false accusations. None of them stuck. And even these last two guys that came, the accusation made no sense and had no basis. And so they didn't have anything on him. So the high priest had to pivot it around and get Jesus to admit that he was the Son of Man.
I was going to quote a verse from Revelations here as well. When John is first receiving his vision of Christ, he quotes Daniel as well. He says, "Look, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all peoples on earth will mourn because of him."
Hmm.
I looked that up right now because I realized, oh man, that goes so perfectly with him, with Jesus's response there.
Well, yeah, and it talks about him being pierced and all the things that he suffered, and in addition to all that was the abuse that was heaped on Christ during his trial and crucifixion. And in Matthew 26, verse 67, the very next verse after the previous passage we read, it says, "Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, 'Prophesy to us, Messiah, who hit you?'" That's
Just imagine
it's pretty despicable
doing
stuff.
that.
Then in chapter 27 of Matthew, verses 27 through 31 says, "Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand. Then they knelt in front of him and mocked him. 'Hail, King of the Jews,' they said. They spit on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him."
Just the imagery is
Yeah,
piercing. I mean, imagine getting hit in the head after they already put a bunch of thorns on
sure.
your head, driving it deeper.
So just the mocking and the abuse, it's funny though, because it's kind of like Shimei. Shimei was throwing sticks and stones down at David, so they were hitting him with sticks.
Yeah.
And then Matthew 27, 35 through 44, a final example of abuse. You want to read that?
Sure. "When they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots, and sitting down, they kept watch over him there. Above his head they placed the written charge against him, 'This is Jesus, the King of the Jews.' 2 rebels were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, 'You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God.' In the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. 'He saved others,' they said, 'but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him, for he said, I am the Son of God.' In the same way, the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him."
So just a terrible scene. And again, that same false accusation that the 2 men had brought earlier in the trial comes forward here and is repeated.
Mm.
And so Jesus being abused as he's led out of Jerusalem to be crucified, and then while he's being crucified. So,
Well, here they have the only true accusation against him, which is that he's trusting in God to save him.
yeah,
And this is, one of the famous things that happens there is on the cross is when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And there's a lot to get into with that. You have Psalm 22, that which he's referencing, but it's also reminiscent of David sending the ark back into Jerusalem once he's gotten out. He's kind of separating God's presence, because the ark was where God was present with his people.
Mhm.
He's separating that from himself and trusting God. That's what he says to Zodak and to Abishai, that God will restore his covenant to him. He'll bring him back into the kingdom if he wants to.
yeah.
And Jesus
that's a
does
great
the
point.
same thing there, trusting and that's his final words in some of the Gospels are, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit."
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And among his other final words, we talked about the last words of David, but among Jesus' last words in Luke 23, 33 through 34, it says, "When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, 'Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing.' And they divided up his clothes by casting lots." And so very similar to, David. There's this mercy, this grace, going on. But in Jesus' case, he's being killed, and while he's being murdered, he forgives those who are murdering him. So
I should have saved that Revelations verse for right there. When John sees Jesus coming on the clouds, and that those who pierced him will see him. That would have been a better placement for it, because that's like David's return into Jerusalem.
yeah,
Shimei, the one who was mocking him, is the first out to greet him.
yeah, that's true. Well, but it is interesting though. So what you just said, David gets lifted back up and brought back into Jerusalem, and even Jesus, entrusts himself to God, allows himself to be crucified, and he's raised back up, and he comes back. And so those aren't really his last words. Just like we saw with David, where David, has the color glossy, release from the home office.
Yeah.
And then later you find out what he actually said to Solomon. But
the PR release.
yeah, so Jesus comes back, and he has some words with his disciples in John chapter 21.
And keep in mind, most people are probably familiar with the story of Peter's denial, right? But when Jesus was arrested, all the disciples scattered. Peter at least followed for a little bit until he was recognized, and then 3 times he denied knowing Jesus or having anything to do with him.
Yeah, yeah. And so Jesus, when he comes back, he's talking with Peter, and just like Shimei, Peter's the first one that wants to get to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Jumps out of the boat and swims to him.
Yeah, that's true. So if you read from the beginning of John 21.
Yeah. Yeah, but when they talk later, Jesus has other words for Peter. And, we saw with David, he pulled Solomon. Solomon's going to be his successor. And he says, hey, there's some people that did some really bad things to me. I want them eliminated.
You're a wise man.
Yeah.
Just don't let their heads go down to the grave peacefully.
Yeah.
It's really, really dark.
But when Jesus has a chance to talk to Peter, who in many ways was a successor of Christ in the movement, the Christian movement, and leading the church, it says in chapter 21, verse 15 of John, it says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The 3rd time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the 3rd time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger and you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. So Jesus, he has the opportunity to come back and give a message of what he wants to see happen after he is gone and someone else is in charge. And his message isn't, go kill all the guys that killed me, right? Mm-hmm. It's go feed them, go take care of them.
Well, and also Peter's going to suffer a similar death, right? He's telling him, don't take revenge on them. Let them kill you too.
Yeah. And his last word there is follow me to him. So it's like, follow my example. Mm-hmm. Now, my example, not David's.
Right. Well, at least he said a good one.
Yeah, that's true. So, so we just have a final reflection we wanted to share with everybody, because we like to try to get to the book of Revelation whenever we can, and looking for the humility of Christ even in eternity. And some of the visions from Revelation portray this pretty well when displaying Jesus as a slain lamb. So you want to read Revelation 5:11 through 14?
Then I looked and heard the voice of many angels, numbering thousands upon thousands, and 10,000 times 10,000. They encircled the throne and the living creatures and the elders. In a loud voice they were saying, worthy is the Lamb who was slain, to receive power and wealth and wisdom and strength, and honor and glory and praise. Then I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and on the sea, and all that is in them, saying, To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be praise and honor and glory and power forever and ever. The four living creatures said, Amen, and the elders fell down and worshipped.
So this is kind of like a fulfillment of the end of Philippians 2
Yeah.
there, where it says every knee is going to bow. And we see that, but it's because he was slain. It was because he submitted himself to that death, that humiliating death on a cross.
Mhm.
And now he reigns as this slain lamb, which is such an odd picture, but I think maybe it's supposed to capture the humility of true leadership, that you have this slain animal as the reigning Lord. Such a strange image.
If you read from the beginning of Revelations 5, John's seeing all these cryptic images in his visions. But what's happening there is that there's a scroll that's sealed in heaven and nobody can open it because nobody's worthy. And this song that the angels and creatures and everyone sing are in response to the appearance of the Lamb who was slain, which is Jesus, who's worthy to open the scroll.
So
And so it's a perfect callback, like you said, to that verse in Philippians 2, because there we saw that God glorified him because he humbled himself.
mm,
And so here, because he's the slain lamb, because he humbled himself, he's the one who's worthy to open the scroll.
so the humble will be exalted.
Right.
Back to the same.
And that's our example is trusting in God, not in our own strength.
Yeah, and so I love that last word into Peter, that follow me, because that's not just something Jesus is saying to Peter. He's saying it to all of us. Look at my example. Look how I faced death. Look how my attitude was toward the people who were murdering me. And he's calling us to that same example, to that same way of life, to that same level of humility. So our New Testament takeaway, right, is going to be that all men must learn the humility of Jesus Christ.
Hmm. Right. And Peter is kind of the leader of the apostles. Like you said, that follow me is to Peter, to the apostles, to everyone that they will go on to make into disciples. It's to all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, we didn't serve a vengeful Lord like David, who gave
Right.
us execution instructions on his way out.
Well, if we did, we'd be the ones getting executed. Right, because we're
we're the
guilty,
ones who
yeah.
murdered Jesus.
Yeah.
All of us are guilty.
So like that passage with Peter, he's both forgiving Peter and he's also not commissioning Peter to go and exact vengeance on others.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, again, our New Testament takeaway is all men must learn the humility of Jesus Christ. And when Jesus was abused, he didn't seek vengeance. He sought the welfare of those who murdered him. He told Peter, go feed my lambs, go take care of my sheep.
Like Philippians 2 says, don't seek after your own interests.
Yeah,
But think about the welfare of everyone else.
that's right. Yeah.
Even those who are doing you wrong.
So our prayer is that each one of you would learn the humility of Jesus Christ. And of course, how can somebody learn to be humble like Christ?
Only by submitting to him. Like what he tells Peter there, as John in the Gospel of John, he adds his own clarifying words that Jesus said he would be, he'd have his hands stretched out. He said that to illustrate the death that Peter would lead. And I've quoted before in past episodes Romans 6, where Paul says, "Do you not know that by baptism you've been baptized into the death of Christ, into the cross?" And so the way that we follow Peter, following Jesus, is ultimate. The first step, at least, is through baptism. That's our submission to let another disciple of Christ, put you under the water. You're submitting to Christ, and symbolically, baptism is that submission to death, into Christ's death.
Yeah, it is a humiliating act, really. I mean, just to be in public and then be dunked in water,
And we do that. We do that with teachers or whatever at a fundraiser with the dunk tank.
dunking booth. Yeah,
And the reason it's fun is because they're they're your annoying teacher or whoever it is.
yeah. So you're willfully, submitting yourself to that, but you're doing it because you're showing, I have a humility toward Christ, that I want to be subject to him. I'm submitting to him. same way that Christ submitted to his Father by going to the cross, you're submitting to the Father by submitting to his Son. And so that's our wish and our goal for this lesson this week, that each one of you would learn that level of humility for your life and going forward.
Yep.
Okay, well, he's Caleb and I'm Timothy, and thank you for listening to Bible Discussions on Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. Please consider subscribing to our channel, because that really helps support the work that we're doing here. Now, all scripture quotations, unless otherwise indicated, are taken from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV, copyright by Biblica, Inc., used by permission of Zondervan, all rights reserved. This program is copyright 2024 by Timothy Klingerman. God bless all of you.